Charter Local Edition with your host, John MacDonald.
Welcome. I am visiting today with Mike Kadas, who is the Montana Department of Revenue Director. Welcome, Mike. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for the opportunity.
So tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up at the Department of Revenue.
Well, I've had a mix of private sector and public sector over the years. Most recently, before becoming Director of Department of Revenue, which was in 2013, I was with a private company, chemical company, Rivertop Renewables. Did that for 5 years. Prior to that, I'd been mayor of the city of Missoula. I'd been in the legislature for 14 years, and then I also ran my own small contracting company.
So you've got a very broad background that you brought to the Department of Revenue?
I've done a lot of things. Some people would argue I just can't hold a job, but I think I get bored with things and I want to do new stuff, and so
Right.
I'm always looking for kind of something new and interesting.
Right. So you're at the Montana League of Cities and Towns meeting here in Bozeman, and obviously one of the things that you have to do or get to do is to work with communities around the state and talk about budget issues. What's the relationship that the Department of Revenue has with all of these cities and all these communities?
Well, cities are, their key funding source is the property tax, and the department has a major role in the property tax in that we are responsible for valuing all of the properties. And so we go through a reappraisal process. Once we figure out kind of the values, then the cities and counties and school districts take those numbers and essentially put those into their budgets, and the end result is how many mills are levied on people's property. Right. So there are a number of steps to the process, but it's absolutely critical. Cities and counties are fundamentally dependent on the property tax to fund the services that they provide.
And so when you come to a meeting like this, what is sort of on your agenda? What do you talk about with all of the cities and towns across Montana?
Well, today we talk mostly about reappraisal and the reappraisal cycle, which has been a big change that we've been implementing just this year. So in addition to that, we have a number of just mechanical issues that we work with local governments on because that funding source is so important, kind of how we do it, the interrelationship between the city finance officer and the local Department of Revenue is key in all of these cases. And so we end up talking about those types of issues and special tax issues, tax increment financing,
Sure.
All kinds of things like that.
Special districts, all those things.
Yep, special districts, newly taxable property.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about what you just mentioned, which was the tax reappraisal. And in the 2015 session, one of the major pieces of legislation was a bill to look at the reappraisal process and look at the reappraisal schedule. So tell folks a little bit about what that is, and for homeowners in Montana and property owners in Montana, what does that mean?
So reappraisal is the act of going in and seeing what the new values are, because values of property change over time. We're all familiar with economic cycles and how that changes the value. And we have a constitutional requirement to equalize values. So that means we have to kind of keep them up to date, and we have to use the same methodology for similar types of property so that people are being treated equally and fairly. So historically, we've had a pretty long cycle. We wouldn't do new reappraisal except every 6 years, sometimes as long as 8 years. And that, when you have that long of a time, you can end up with real disparities. So the last cycle ended in 2008. Well, that was the peak of a housing boom,
right.
And then housing prices fell. So we were implementing increased housing values at the same time that values were going down. So it was very confusing and I think very angering to lots of taxpayers. How could this possibly be going on? And it was because we had such a long cycle. So we were able to pass legislation last session that moves the cycle to just every 2 years. So we're right now implementing the values of what your property was worth on January 1, 2014. We're going to be developing the values for the next cycle, which will be January 1, 2016. So we're only, we'll be a couple of years behind, but not 5, 6, 7, 8 years behind.
Right.
So that'll be a huge increase of benefit in accuracy and we'll be able to remove the phase-in that we had required. We used to phase in 1/6 of the difference between appraisals every year, and that was really hard to explain to everybody.
Right.
And so we won't have to do that anymore. So I think it will be a lot easier to understand the system. There are still some things we can do to simplify it, but it's really critical for taxpayers to be able to understand kind of how we do this, and it's the combination of how we set the values and then how local governments set millages. So those two steps are critical. This is a big simplification effort. It'll be important for policymakers too. They'll be able to understand the system, be able to articulate what they want to see happen with it.
Right. And during the last session, this required a lot of work from your agency and you personally. I know you spent a lot of time at legislative hearings, even held a couple of sort of additional educational hearings for not only legislators, but people like me that needed to understand this. The upshot of that was you had a fairly good, broad, bipartisan support on this bill, didn't you?
Absolutely. This bill passed both houses, both by pretty much 2-to-1 margins.
Mm-hmm.
We spent a lot of time with the Senate Taxation Committee.
Right.
We had a hearing like we always do, but then we had 4 lengthy work sessions, which is pretty unusual for legislative process.
Yeah.
So I very much appreciate Chairman Dept and the other members of that committee and the kind of time they were willing to spend with the issue and work through. I mean, it was a collaboration where we all worked together and we came up with a pretty good product.
Yeah.
That came out of that committee. I think there was maybe 1 vote against it.
Yeah. Last quick question for you. When you come to the League of Cities and Town meetings like this, what's the big issue that people ask you about as the director of the Department of Revenue?
You know, I don't think there is one. You know, they're so dependent on property tax, and we have, in Montana law, we have a mechanism that caps how much money they can get from the property tax. And that forces, so they're concerned about how that mechanism gets implemented. And then because that mechanism only allows 50% of inflation, and they have to deal with inflation no matter what. So they're always looking for other ways to
fill that gap.
To fill the gap.
Yeah.
And it's a big challenge.
Yeah.
I sympathize with them.
Well, Mike, I appreciate your time today. We have been visiting with Mike Kadas, the Department of Revenue Director for the state of Montana. Mike, thanks again. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Charter Local Edition has been an exclusive presentation of Charter Communications, providing original programming.